Stay hungry, stay foolish.
Before we launch into part 3 of Hidden Truths with David Fubini, I want to thank our sponsor, Zai, boldly transforming the future of financial services with a suite of products and services enabling businesses to move funds with ease and manage multiple payment workflows. Check out Zai at hellozai.com. Let's get into part 3 of Hidden Truths with David Fubini. It is such a great pleasure to welcome back the author of Hidden Truths, David Fubini. Welcome back.
Thrilled to be back, and thank you for inviting me back.
One of the benefits of us having a little bit of a break between parts 1 and 2 was I had ordered a pin. You know, this nerdy thing I do about the pins. I had ordered this pin, and I'm going to just put it in the camera there. It's a kid covering their mouth, as in don't speak up. And I thought it was so perfect for Hidden Truths when I first got in touch with you to ask you onto the show. But feedback has been magnificent, David. I'm so grateful. And so many CEOs got in touch and went, that is exactly what I needed to hear. It was a wake-up call. I'm sure you hear that a lot yourself.
Apropos your pin, there's a lot of CEOs who don't feel like they can say things, but then when you actually ask them to tell, often retired CEOs, in particular, they're so open and so engaging, and they're so wanting to talk about their experiences. And so it's wonderful to sort of have that opportunity to pass that along to your listeners.
I really mean the feedback has been so good. One of the pieces of feedback I received was, hey, Aidan, love your content. A little bit too long sometimes because you go deep. So what we're going to do is do 2 parts, about 30 minutes each or so, and get deep into some concepts. This part we're going to talk about is the loneliness of being a CEO. Once you step into that role, it becomes a lonely place. Then mentorship, which is something that many people they actually don't know what it really means as well. And then maybe in part 2, we'll talk about rebuilding the bridge with the board, or building a bridge in the first place, because it's oftentimes it's a broken relationship, as you talk about within the book. So how about we start off with the loneliness of being a CEO? I thought I'd kind of relate it to my own knowledge, my own formative knowledge, which was in sports, because there's an iconic rugby coach over this part of the world. Many people hate him. Many people love him. He was the former coach of Australia, Japan, and now he's the UK's rugby team coach, a guy called Eddie Jones. And he said in his autobiography something fascinating, David, that I thought would tee you up nicely. He said, I prefer not to talk to anyone on the team bus. It's a lonely job, and I'm used to its solitary nature. When I became Australia's head coach in 2001, Rod McQueen, who was his predecessor, explained the challenges of the job. His final words hit home. You're now the loneliest man in Australia. And I thought about, that's exactly what David suggests happens once you take up office as the CEO in a large organization.
I think this was one of the more surprising findings I encountered when I went around and talked to CEOs, in particular those who had been retired. And they said, reflecting back, this was something they were ill prepared for. Your coach, had a former helped them along, understand it. CEO said, I suddenly realized I have nobody to talk to. I really, it's hard for me. I mean, listen, I have 100 people I can talk to, but to have a real deep personal conversation where I'm sharing openly and transparently, I really don't have that. My board conversations are always we'll talk about the board, always, tainted by the fact that the board is in judgment of me. So it's hard to have an open and candid conversation when at the end of the day, they are judging me. It's really difficult to talk to if I was an internal candidate, to talk to the people I used to work with, because now I'm their boss, and that's a challenge. If I'm new, because I'm an external to the organization, I'm coming in, I don't really have the relationships with those folks. They don't know me. And no matter what, it's going to be a subordinate to the CEO relationship. My peers, I can talk to at sort of some, events that are held where, we come together. But a lot of that is, talking to other people's facades. We have to be very careful. We can't let down, and really talk personally to one another in a big setting where we're on a podium together, because there's always issues of conflict and disclosing and also, really, for the most part, I don't have relationships with those CEOs because they've been my competitors or they're in a different industry. So it's like, well, where do I go to have a conversation? And so this is why it's a real challenge. And it's something that obviously consultants like myself, try and fill that void, but we can only do that partially. Obviously, we all have partners at home that can help, but they don't understand all the details of what we're experiencing. So it does feel very lonely.
It's so important. You mentioned there about the consultancy role, and I do play that role. And I just want to make it clear, I'm not touting for business here. Right. I'm busy, but I work with a couple of CEOs, and I play that role almost like an agent provocateur, so to provoke thinking, essentially. And it's so important because I thought about something about, I don't know if you ever saw the show, Jim Carrey was the star of this show called The Truman Show. And
yes,
essentially it was a reality show, and they were forming his reality by presenting certain characters, etc. And I thought about how it's exactly the same with CEOs, because so many people are afraid to speak up, and hence the pin as well. They're afraid to speak up in case they get tainted, in case they fall victim to shooting the messenger effect, because it is a dangerous place to be.
And it is. And so it's also why it's funny, there's a number of former CEOs on the Harvard faculty here, and they get reached out to because they've obviously been there, done that job, and they can obviously provide a consultative support of the type even you and I can't do, because I, for one, have never been a CEO, and I make that very clear at the outset of the book. I'm writing more as an observer rather than a participant in that role. But this is the thing that was most striking, was how surprising it was for them, that this was like, oh my heavens, I suddenly have nobody to talk to when all my career I've had many.
And David, any advice for those CEOs? Because we did say the last time, build your network before you get into the office. So you need that. You need to build that capability before you need it. But what can you do when you're in the office and you kind of go, uh-oh, I can't speak to anyone here?
Well, the first of all is it's really helpful. And most of us have kitchen cabinets that we have developed through a network of people as we've gone through our careers. And it's really important for a CEO to have some sort of a group of people that he can or she can be talking to. It need not be a huge number. We're talking 2 or 3 people that are really go-to people for advice and counsel. Will come and talk about mentorship. These usually are mentors who have stayed with them for a while. And so you want to tap that. Secondly, many CEOs have used some on their staff as real people that they can confide in. These are usually people who are not destined to be their replacements, but rather, clear advisors who have a role that is distinctly different from other operating roles. So like the general counsel often turns out to be somebody, or the chief human resource officer you can turn to and really have a very in-depth relationship with. It's sometimes still fraught with the challenge of, being, somebody's obvious boss, but, you really can nurture that relationship and be open to it. The third is, you can understand that there's going to be a reluctance to sometimes talk to you and be open and candid. But if you model the behavior of being, receptive to and open to and frankly sharing of and empathetic, you'll get more of a relationship from both your board as well as from peers, as well as from subordinates. Now, I'm not suggesting it can always be without some level of, placating and, and telling you what you want to hear. But you might have less of that if you really are yourself open to and candid about getting that feedback and wanting it. And just in the back of your mind, always wondering, well, how much am I hearing this because you think it's what I want to hear? But those who come in and much as your coach analogy and story, and really say, I'm going to sit on the bus and not say anything to anybody, well, then you're going to be a very, very lonely person. So I would say you have to follow the antithesis of that in the corporate setting as opposed to a sporting setting.
And as you say, even though you might be able to speak about work to your spouse, many times your spouse is the last thing they want to hear, especially for my wife, for example, minding kids all day, and I come in with my woes from the office. It's like, you take the kids, buddy.
The CEOs I had the pleasure of working with over my years at McKinsey, there'd always be one or two people that are just, or one or two things, but primarily people that bother them that, and I'm sure that they go home to their partners and they say, I cannot believe how, Sally or Sam is doing. And, and I think your partner's like, would you just deal with them? I mean, good Lord, I'm tired of hearing about Sally and Sam.
It's great advice. I really lean into the whole Carl Jung thing about lean into those people, learn what they're trying to teach you.
Always. And, we write these whole scenarios about relationships and we have a certain set of beliefs, and there's a voice in your head saying, here's what really is happening. And you really got to challenge that voice in your head. You really have to challenge it because you're probably most often wrong.
I did a really interesting thing recently, David. I wrote down all the people in my life that I had friction with, that I believed I had friction with, going right back to childhood. And this is going back about 2 years. And then I reached out to some of them that I could, and I met them. But what I found was there was patterns in the type of character, and some of them even looked alike. So some people from my childhood kind of reemerged later on, resurfaced later in my life, and I was like, wow, that's really interesting. So if you believe in karma and those type of things, I'm kind of going, I wonder what was there. But it was, the reason I share it was the value in letting go of it and not holding on to that, and not those type of people that you'd see coming down the street and you would cross the road that you don't have to anymore.
In a similar vein, when I joined the faculty at Harvard, there are some really people that are extraordinarily well known. All your listeners and viewers would know many of them. One of them happens to be a really, really super accomplished woman who's just by very presence and physical as well as mental acuity and present and role in the place. She's just a dominant personality, and I remember saying to some others, very senior practitioners that were teaching, I said, she scares me. And so I actually decided to, I scheduled time with her, and I walked in and I said, you should know that you're a spectacular person, but you really scare the hell out of me. And I just thought I'd tell you that because I figured if maybe we could sort of get past that. Anyway, this lovely conversation. It turns out she's an absolute marshmallow inside, and and can't be the nicest, most kindest, gentlest person. And I had it all wrong, and now we have this wonderful relationship. But if you're willing to confront that, it makes a big difference. So, yeah, I don't know if that's apropos of this whole
brilliant
thing we're talking about, but it is still important.
It's gold, because I do think dealing with those things, so it's hard enough in the workplace without battling within the workplace, try and battle against the competitor on the outside and the changing markets. But let's move on to mentorship. And I was thinking about, there's a few different ways to view mentorship. There's you receiving mentorship as the CEO, but there's also you creating a succession plan of mentorship, mentoring maybe a second in command. And I wanted to start with that one because, again, some personal experience here is I always believed in the whole idea of bringing others along with you, but it can be dangerous, again, because, for example, what happened to me was in my role, I mentored somebody and she was brilliant and she went on to do amazing things. But when I kind of handed over as much as I could what I was thinking and how I did things, I could feel the staring eyes of the CFO kind of going, we won't need Aidan anymore. He's on X amount of money. We could be saving that. And I could just see the calculator working in his brain every time. And ultimately it led to kind of friction between us, and I left the organization because really my whole thing was make yourself redundant so you can move upwards and do better things. But ultimately I hit a ceiling. And in the moment, I felt awful about it. I was angry about it. I was angry with him, etc. He was on my list, for example, for a while. But then, as always happens in life, you realized, well, I kind of needed that forest fire, and now it's released me to do other things, and it's all worked out. But in the moment, it can be difficult, and I totally get it. If you're a CEO and your identity is wrapped in your position, you feel a little bit of danger about mentoring somebody else who might take your place.
Well, first of all, let's do a couple of things. Let's describe what mentorship is, so that viewers and listeners understand. There's a difference between being a coach and a mentor. A coach is somebody who comes in and says, "You're at this level of skill. I'd like you to get to this level of skill. There's a certain amount of improvement I'm going to seek to get over." It's a transactional relationship. I do something and I improve you from baseline to this level, but then I leave. Or my role is different. Mentorship is like, no, I'm worried about your whole being. I'm worried about who you are as a person. Yes, in relationship to our professional relationship, but also our personal relationship. I care about where you are in the world. And I think ours is a familiar relationship that will continue beyond the moment that we find ourselves in. That's what true mentorship means. Now, to your point, Jack Welch of GE fame has a famous YouTube video, which your viewers might want to just get, because he basically says what you just said, which is he thinks mentorship stinks, because he says you get with somebody, then it turns out that they're your mentor, then people dislike that mentor, they fire that person, and then you're like the old guy's disciple, and we're going to fire you too. So he said, don't ever have mentors. Now, I love Jack. I knew him pretty well when he was here in Boston. I totally disagree with that perspective, but I'm just telling you, many could have that. CEOs, can mentor their executives, because they really will get so much more out of them if they are feeling as if they're being actually not just coached, but cared for, that there's a real empathy for them and you want them to succeed. Because, by the way, CEOs are more successful if their BU leaders and their operational people are being better at their jobs and more successful. And they will be if they're mentored. Yes, in the back of their heads, I'm sure most CEOs do know that they're actually enabling their replacements to be developed. But, I think for the most part, CEOs who I spoke to basically say, I know that, and I know I have a certain length of time. But frankly, this way, I at least ensure that my team is more solid. I get the beneficiary of that ability. And frankly, I can have a legacy that says I left this to an internal candidate. We didn't have to go outside to replace me because I didn't do my job, which was to create an internal candidate to replace me. On the other hand, it is difficult to do on the day-to-day, because it's like, my God, if I spend more time with Aidan, he's really been a rocket ship, and my God, he's going to just blow right past me. That does exist, but you've got to fight that natural instinct.
I loved your father's quote, cooperate with the inevitable.
Right.
And you say you'd offer the same advice to CEOs. CEOs have to use the need for successors to their advantage, you say, not see it as a threat to their continuity. I love what you said there. There's another great quote, perhaps you'll expand upon. You said, in the command and control past, mentorship was less important because senior execs tended to be directive and senior staff was informed as to what was expected of them. With a bit of coaching and a great deal of performance pressure, employees would respond positively and learning was more experiential. Today, however, the demands of the market and the expectations of employees at all levels require greater development initiative, an embrace of learning, and a pursuit of personal growth and developmental learning opportunities. Mentors facilitate such activities. Again, love that.
It's because, and we talked about this earlier in our conversations and in the book, the huge number of constituents that one now has to deal with on any topic is so much greater. The communication challenges are so much more deeper and more challenging because now we have social media and traditional media that one has to deal with. There's advocacy groups that you didn't have before. There's activists you didn't have to worry about previously. So all of this makes this so much more challenging than it used to be in the command and control environment. And that's why, a whole generation of CEOs have come through and tried the command and control, and it rarely works. It only really works in deep functional one product type companies. Doesn't work anymore for the reasons you just are articulating.
Another topic you talk about in your dedicated chapter 2 is aligned to mentorship in somewhat. This is about walking the talk, and you say CEOs need to use role modeling as an essential change management asset. I thought you'd bring us through this. You say the hard truth is that CEOs often don't like to do the role modeling that is required to accelerate their change programs. And as a consultant, you were always surprised by the comfort CEOs took in being in their own offices rather than being out there, either walking the talk, talking to customers, being in the war room. Sometimes they're not even in the war room, working on strategy of their own companies.
This is one of those things that I observed throughout my time as a consultant, and certainly even now, I observe it when I work with organizations on a variety of manners. There's this sort of comfort in the home status of being in my office. I'm in control. I have my staff around me. I know exactly what's going to happen in almost any meeting. It's sort of, the power of the known is very seductive. And CEOs will often say, look, this is the more efficient use of my time. I can really, see many people this way. What you're talking about is I have to leave the comfort of this office is what they're really having in their heads, but they're saying to you, I have to go and I have to travel and I have to spend time in it very inefficiently. I'm not really, I'm really not basically doing my job in the way I think is best done. Who cares if I walk through a factory floor? Who will really ever notice? And, just that factory will know. They don't know all the other things. And I keep saying, you are so wrong, because one is you're so carefully watched as a leader. People know exactly what you're doing, where you spend your time, who you meet with. They know. If they don't know for certain, they get told and they infer it from of what they read about you. So how you visibly spend your time is an incredible signal to your organization. So if you're out visiting a factory, other factories will assure you know it. If you're out meeting with customers, other customers will know it. And then your own people will know it. Your own sales force will say, oh my God, he's visiting that incredibly important customer for us. I hope, that means he probably cares about what we're doing. He understands us. That's the power of the role modeling behavior. Our political leaders know how to do this almost to a fault because they just do stuff for show, the usual ribbon cutting stuff. It has to be substantive too. You just cannot show up for show. You've got to really want to know when you're walking around a factory, stop and ask people, why are you doing things the way you do? How can we do things better? The most powerful thing you can always say is, how can I help? In any organization you ever meet. I had one CEO tell me the thing that he learned most on a tour he did of sales offices and customers was, yes, it was important to see the customers, but he was not surprised by what they had to say. What he was surprised about was the salesperson who was driving him around at every different city. He said, I learned so much from them because they told me the truth in a way that I would not have understood otherwise. I saw how they spend their days. That was a great learning lab. That's what role modeling is. And it's so powerful. It's a form of communication that has great power and it's underused.
One of the other parts you talk about is, okay, you mentioned about how do you spend your time. You call this calendar management, but you mentioned again on one of your lunches with Jack Welch how you asked him, you're like, come on, Jack, really, how long do you spend on, the learning organization? And it revealed the truth behind the amount of work that he did do on that. It wasn't all execution. It wasn't all strategy. It was a lot of nurturing.
And, and I was shocked when I said, you don't really spend as much time as people say you do on human resource management and training. He said, if anything, it's understated. It's really, now, again, remember, this is a different era, different time. But still, I think it's valuable, as you point out, that the learning organization, and it gets back to the mentorship point, it takes time. And you have to sit with people and you have to understand them and help them. And, this isn't like sitting down and have a cup of coffee for 10 minutes and, checking the box. This is my sitting down and really understanding who these people are, how I can help them, and really what motivates them. There's a really wonderful story. This is getting back to your sporting analogy. Red Auerbach was a famous coach of the Celtics. and he won 11 championships, I think, in 12 years with Bill Russell. And Bill Russell explaining the success that the two of them had was that Red Auerbach had the best ears in the NBA, he said. He would actually listen to every player and know how to motivate and coach that individual player because he listened better than any coach. And he tailored his approach. And it was why he was so successful. And I always think that's something you should ask yourself as a CEO or leader. Are you the best? Do you have the best ears in your organization? Are you listening the best? Because, a lot of leaders think they need to talk. Really what they need to do is listen.
And again, it's, as you say, it was a shift. And one of the things that, just to highlight on the Jack Welch stuff, is that in the time that they were leading a learning organization, it wasn't a done thing, because it's kind of like everybody's at least attempting it now. But back then, that was highly unusual as well. Just to tip the hat to Jack, may you rest in peace.
Just on role model, let's also remind ourselves that Jack has many faults, as many CEOs do, and we all do. But when it came to replace him, he had 4 internal candidates. That now we can all argue whether or not Emmett was the right choice, but the point is that he had 4. He then he didn't abandon the others. He got them jobs. I mean, they all got massively important jobs. So that's mentorship, right? That's really, really a great example from Jack. Even, as you say, now that he's passed, it's so useful to remember that part of him.
Again, going against the grain, because many people who go for the CEO role often leave the organization because they feel they kind of have to as well, which is just, again, magnificent. But it reflects also, you're saying about where do you spend your time by role modeling as a CEO. In doing that also, by going around the organization, seeing what people are doing on the floor, you're also delivering what I love you call psychic rewards. And just to talk about incentives, I grew up when I worked in the pub. I was telling you before, I got an operation, a surgery on varicose veins here. I couldn't have had a worse upbringing for varicose veins. Firstly, genetics. Secondly, worked in a bar when I was a kid. And third, had a career playing rugby and stand on my feet for a living today. So everything's going against me. But going back to the bar days, so in my teens, David, I worked in a bar, and I used to come in early, like 6 a.m., clean the place. It was 4 floors, clean it from top to tail, then become a cellar boy bringing in the kegs of beer, then become a cleaner, and then become a barman. And it used to make me really envious to see the lounge boys and girls getting tips, especially from American tourists, because we don't really tip very well over here in Ireland, this part of the world. But then you saw changes in behaviors, because when the lounge boys or girls saw that it was an American tourist, they knew they were good tippers. They all flocked, and they all kind of like, vultures around a carcass looking for the tips. And I say that to say how incentives really, really tilt behavior in certain ways. And sometimes it's good, sometimes it's not so good, which is why you talk about the power of psychic rewards.
We all need a certain minimum level of compensation, and above that. So before you get to that level, whatever that is for all of you individually, yes, monetary always trumps psychic. But at some point over that minimum threshold, over time, the value of the cash rewards you get does, plateau. It just does. For the amount, not enough more money that you throw at somebody is going to really change their behavior. The exceptions probably are sports stars and Hollywood stars. Other than that, for the most part, people, because they measure their worth on the basis of what they got paid for the last film. CEOs and other executives don't. So the psychic reward does have an asymptotic relationship. Compensation rewards. But psychic rewards are always incredibly powerful. And the more you use, the better they are to motivate people. What are psychic rewards? They are, hey, you did a fabulous job. Thank you. That's a psychic reward right there. I want to give you a committee assignment if you're in a professional service firm to help us guide the strategy of the organization. Could you lead recruiting because you're such a powerful force, in the firm? I'd like you to take that out and get others like you. Psychic reward. We're having a training program for high profile people. I want you to go on a psychic reward. These are the things that people, really value. It's amazing. And there's so many examples I can give you. So those are things that are, to individuals. I have CEOs who once led a major cost reduction activity, and so he took a 1 year savings from a particular unit. I can't remember exactly how he determined this, but yeah, he ended up sending checks to all the participants and said, look, here's the 10% of the savings you achieved, and I'm giving this back to you as a psychic reward. And he said to me, David, it was amazing. I went back and I said, why didn't anybody cash the checks? And he said, because you know what? They all framed them and put them up on in their offices because they're so proud to have been recognized for their work. So even to that extent, they're actually foregoing the financial just to get the psychic return. So the power here is really important, and it is so easily done, and it just is what people long for. And so feed them that, and you'll be the great beneficiary of it.
And David, let's talk about the flip side. One of the amazing things I heard during the pandemic was, so Ireland has many tech giants based here. So many of the companies are based here. And one of them, maybe all of them, I'm not sure, but I heard this story about one of them in particular had said to its employees, okay, we know we used to give you breakfast on campus. We used to feed you on campus. We can't do that during COVID. So what we're going to do is you get yourself an Uber Eats, you get yourself Deliveroo, whatever it is, and we'll pay for it. Just keep your receipts. So people started to do that. Then when things started to defrost after the pandemic, things started to open up again. It was like, no, we need you back in the office. Some people are like kind of going, don't really want to do that. And they're like, okay, well, we're not paying for your deliveries anymore, right? And then I'm just talking about how behavior is shaped here. People would come in, have one meeting in the morning and have their breakfast and go home and work from home again. And it just shows you how they can backfire as much as they can help. Maybe you have some thoughts on that.
In some respects, this is sort of a monetary incentive as opposed to a psychic, because it really is, if I'm using your breakfast facilities, then I'm not paying for it. So it's a transference of money. It would be more powerful if you were to call up somebody in that context and say, look, we need you here in the office because without your presence, others won't come. Now, I've done nothing to actually reward you other than to say, and by the way, I'm encouraging you to come back to the office, which is something you may want to do. But now I'm telling you, you have to come, because if you come, others follow. Oh my God. I'm like, man, of course I'll come. Now that's how that you can do a psychic reward to achieve the same thing you're trying to do with regard to a monetary reward. And there's a famous, not so famous, but a favorite example, which I'm not going to take the time to go through here, but in the book, where UPS drivers, would unfortunately hit things when they're driving. These trucks are very expensive and very big, and they cost money to repair. And they tried to pay for better performance, and it didn't work. It modified, but not in a meaningful way. So what they said to the drivers is, look, if you drive successfully in the US, at least over a certain length of time, you get to wear a bomber jacket. We'll give you a bomber jacket as a reward, and you get to be in the Driver Hall of Fame. And when I'm teaching this, I always ask people, well, how long do you think they had to drive safely before they earned this award? And many people think, a year, maybe 2. And it turns out it's 25 years. They have to drive safely, 25 years. And so people are like shocked by this. And what's even more shocking is that 1,200 drivers have achieved this objective. And most importantly, they drive safer. And you're giving out a bomber jacket. So that's the power of psychic returns.
Beautiful example to end this episode on. Let's wrap this one up and then we'll come back, because I mentioned breakfast there. It's early morning for David over in the US, so he probably needs some sustenance. We'll take a quick break and we'll record part 2. We'll be back with diversity and inclusion. We'll be back with getting on board with your board as well. Extremely important. 2 topics that are so important and often overlooked. David, for now, I just want to remind our audience, I have given away 2 copies of your brilliant book already. I have one left up for grabs, copy of Hidden Truths, What Leaders Need to Hear But Are Rarely Told by David Fubini. David, before we finish, where can people find you for those who don't join us for the final episode?
Well, you can always find me on the Harvard website. You just look up Harvard Business School. If you put in McKinsey or Fubini, I'll pop up. You can send me an email. I'm available on LinkedIn as well. So those are the easiest ways to find me.
David, thanks so much. We'll see you soon.
Thank you.
As always, I want to thank our sponsor, Xi, boldly transforming the future of financial services with a suite of embedded products and services, enabling businesses to manage multiple payment workflows and move funds with ease. Check out Xi at helloxi.com, and we'll see you very soon.